God is my judge.
God is my judge. That's Daniel's name. That's what it means. So we want to review a little bit of the history to frame it again. This is a book just filled with cool stories, I would say, but also as misunderstood now because it got caught up in the whole Left Behind series, if you remember, in the 1970s. And so everyone is trying to interpret the future wrongly, I would say, instead of in a biblical prophetic way, which always leaves an out because God's mercy is always available, instead of just saying, okay, this is what's going to happen in history. It's rather, okay, this is going to happen. However, if you turn and repent, and that's sort of Daniel, right? In some of these interactions with the king. So we want to go over a little bit of the history, and then I thought we would take a look at a couple of the stories that we remember, and I think we love, right? Which is great. Okay. But first, I want to give a plug, and Melissa's already responded to this. I just told Melissa I was just thrilled with her response. Is the Sunday Forum is about art this week. It's already up. It's Where is God in the Painting? And so we take a look at the church a little bit, because we've got art, the windows in the sanctuary. We've got some. We even highlight one of Gina's, her calendar with the dog, which is kind of funny. So what we do is we take a trip to the East-West Gallery at the Mercado, run by a Russian woman whose name is Olga Archangelskaya. She and her daughter Lisa have another gallery down on Fifth, right? But the better one is
in our neighborhood.
We should record this. No, but it's a bigger one that can show more at that art gallery, a more diversified. I think down on Fifth, it's more about sort of Naples art, beach scenes and that sort of thing. Where up here, there's some more classical pieces. So we asked her to this very deep Christian woman, baptized as an adult. And I think Howard, people who have been in, we're talking about Olga, who runs the East-West Gallery. People from Naples, she's been here a while, and people in Naples, I guess, know her well. I only knew her through Robert, who was friends with she and her sister. So we go there, and she interprets 3 pieces. And so I just think she does a marvelous job. And the last one is just a regular forest scene. And we ended the video by saying, now, can you see God in your art at home? As this is, she kind of gives an example of how to see God in the art. And sometimes when it's very religious, you can just see the religious images. It's easier to read, like some of the pieces in church. But others might be harder to read. And she's got some that are quite almost like Daniel. It's one of the reasons I mentioned it. It's kind of dystopian, that the world is coming to an end. And there is Jesus, the Son of Man, sitting in the middle of this destruction. I mean, that's sort of Daniel in a way. She also does the woman to the well, but that's I think a very intriguing piece as well. So at the end, I say, if you have a piece of art in your home that always God speaks to you through that piece of art, I want you to take a picture of it and send it to me with one sentence, just one sentence to say why that artwork means so much to you, what you hear, how does God speak to you through that art piece. So this was published Tuesday night. Melissa sends immediately a beautiful northeastern, right? Of the rocks, or is it?
It might be northeastern, or it might be California. I've done both. Ocean,
So it's quite striking on the seaside, cliffs, lighthouse, plants climbing the rocks. And her description was just marvelous. So I quickly took Melissa's picture, ran over to the Mercado, showed Olga, and she was thrilled. So then we're trying to figure out when you why you were so articulate. When did that all happen? Was that a result of her description? Had you always thought that way? And so I found out just this morning, because I asked Melissa, you know, how did this, she said, well, I painted the picture. That was what I did back in the,
1990s, yeah.
do you still paint?
No, I don't. No, I haven't painted since coming down here. No time.
Too busy.
Darn retirement. There's no
Yeah.
time to
Oh,
do
yeah.
something.
We're glad you're here.
So I can't wait to tell Olga that you had actually painted it, but that it was in response to how she described some of her art, that you put some, I thought, some really wonderful language to that art piece. And that's kind of what we want to do collectively, is take a look at our art, because I'm sure you have something in your house that speaks to you. It always has. That's why you got it hanging there. And we just love to know about it. And if I get enough of them, I'm going to go back to Olga, interview her again, but I'm going to show her our church's art pieces, the ones in our homes, and have her respond to what you're writing. So that's, if you don't send me any, I'm not going to do it. All right. You remember, let's start with Daniel. You remember Ezekiel, some of the history, right? We're going to repeat this a couple times just because it's got to, got to get in there. But, we got 3 big empires, and we're going to lean into a 4th with Daniel. We're going to also lean into the Greeks. But we've got, remember the Assyrians?
Yes.
They're the ones who come and wipe out the 10 tribes in the north. Once they wipe out the 10 tribes in the north, 722, they're gone forever. And that was sort of the idea, you take them into exile, you make them slaves all over the place. You don't want too many slaves in your own place, so you spread them out over your empire, so they can't build rebellion like they did in Egypt, right, where they're collective and strong.
They did it in Rome too.
What's
I
that?
said they did it in Rome too, too many slaves.
You can get too many, but it wasn't too many slaves from one place. So you could bring African slaves, you could bring Asian slaves. That's okay, because they're probably won't find social cohesion to
different cultures. Yeah.
different cultures, different languages. And that's the whole idea. You don't want to create rebellion. You want to kind of have people lose their identity, their homeland now, their religion, all that's gone. But then what you do is replace that with people from other places. So now you put other slaves into, as we know now, Samaria. So was kind of standard practice at this time. So first you have the Assyrians wiping out the north, and then you got Isaiah and others, Jeremiah, saying, okay, but now Jerusalem's disobedient. Jerusalem is also now, Judah is going to get attacked as well, but now from Babylon. So now we have an empire shift from Assyria to Babylon. And this is where the book of Daniel begins, with that great king that we all love to say and print out and spell his name, Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, good king Nebuchadnezzar. And again, we all have to thank our Sunday school teachers when we were 8 and 9 years old, because she would always say Nebuchadnezzar, and so we got it today. Just like we got Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. How do we remember that? Well, it was our Sunday school teacher when we were 8, all those stories. It's right. It's early learning. And so I think that's why we know Daniel. I think that's why we have a relationship with Daniel, because it was Sunday school, who taught us these were so important. Daniel, it's thought by most that he is writing this at the end of this Babylonian period, because of this famous story of the writing of the law that we'll talk about today. Nebuchadnezzar's son is all freaked out. Basically, the storyline is Daniel's hauled off, like with Ezekiel, one of the early raids of Judah, into being a servant. And as always was the case, someone will look over the servants. And what did you do with the pretty women? Concubine. And remember how long Esther was put into being pricked and preened?
Like 2 years.
A year.
Yeah.
How long was Daniel?
2 years.
I think was it 2 or 3?
I think it's 3.
He was trained for there he was to be trained for 3 years
Oh, 3 years, my bad.
Yep.
All 4 of them.
to enter the king's presence.
Mm.
Now, he's not taking baths and getting all.
He's
the
learning the
perfumes.
language and.
He's learning the language, he's
culture.
learning the customs, he's learning
Mhm.
the rules. It does not say this. I assume that he was castrated. I think you're not gonna let a man, let alone an educated man, into the royal palace unless he's castrated. Doesn't say this.
Oh.
Second Kings 20 though talks, about your men will be castrated. So basically, I assume everyone who's mentioned here who was brought into the king's royal palace was castrated. And for some, that was your ticket to glory. I just say it, no pain, no gain. That was the only way, but it was a prominent position. It was a more comfortable position. I would say much more comfortable than being a concubine, quite honest, because you had real work to do and real authority, and you just could not have any love interests in the palace. It just was not tolerated. And they didn't want the intrigue, they didn't want jealousy, they didn't want stray children floating around, all those things. So my guess is Daniel's castrated. Now, why do we want to hold on to it? I mean, it's an interesting piece of information, but remember Ezra and Nehemiah, who was not allowed in the temple when they went back to Jerusalem? Eunuchs.
Yes.
Because if you were castrated, you were not allowed, you were mutilated. And any mutilated body was not allowed in the temple. Them's the rules.
Yeah.
So my brother, who's got cerebral palsy, always complains against those Old Testament texts, because he said, I wouldn't have made it. They wouldn't have let me go to worship because his legs weren't straight. And that was just part of the purification laws.
He did marry. Daniel married Susanna.
Are we sure about that?
So Daniel's wife in the Bible. And he took a wife named Susanna.
In Babylon?
Or maybe beforehand.
No,
I
he
think
did.
it's
She
beforehand,
died.
yeah. I don't think he was married, and they just wouldn't have allowed it. He could have had a wife,
Right.
but it's like slavery in the United States, right? You might be separated if the master didn't want a family, then they just split them up. If it was to their economic benefit, that's what they did. Same thing here in Daniel. It's kind of brutal. A little different though, they wanted them castrated again so they would be loyal. But here it is, people like Daniel can go back, some of them, to Jerusalem when the Persians come in, right? Darius conquers the Babylonians, and that's going to be right after this book.
So Xerxes.
A lot of people then are sent back to Jerusalem. Some of them are eunuchs. They're the most talented people among the exiles because they run an empire. Running little old Jerusalem is going to be a piece of cake compared to the responsibilities and the training they had in Babylon. But then Ezra and Nehemiah are going, God said they couldn't serve. So now what do you do? Now we got this even in the New Testament. Remember where the eunuch with Philip meets the eunuch, and that's part of the story. He's working in Egypt, he's working in the royal palace in Egypt, and therefore he's castrated. So here he is, a talented man, educated, well-read, and a God-fearer is the way it's described in Acts. And you see in Acts this movement forward. Now, what gives Philip, we're going to tie it back to Daniel, the permission to evangelize a eunuch?
Holy Spirit talked to him, didn't
And yes, the Holy Spirit tells him to do it. Why could the Holy Spirit do that? Was there any biblical justification? The answer is yes. Isaiah is the one who in the 50s, I can't remember, 52, maybe 55, Isaiah 55 says, you will go back and God will pour out his spirit on all flesh, even those who are disabled, even the eunuchs. I will make my way straight. Remember in the desert, these beautiful, well, the whole eunuch thing was important. Isaiah seeing not only a vision of what God was doing, this new thing, but we need the eunuchs. If we're going to rebuild Jerusalem, we can't just write off a whole group of our most talented administrators, expect that we can build the walls and build the temple and build Jerusalem. So again, this would have been the Daniel types, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego types, who then went back to rebuild. And then the question is, will they be allowed to rebuild or not? Can they be part of God's new thing? And there the prophet comes and says, yes. So pretty amazing. So here it is, Daniel, here's one. I don't know if you can read that, but here are all 11 chapters. You've got Daniel's training in chapter 1. You've got his dream interpreted in chapter 2. So who loves Daniel? Nebuchadnezzar, right? King Nebuchadnezzar loves him because he can interpret dreams.
All day.
Isn't it interesting? It's like we're going back to Joseph
Yes.
again,
Yes.
that somehow this being able to interpret dreams is really part of this Old Testament biblical tradition. Even extended in the New Testament, right? We get that in the Gospels as well. Nebuchadnezzar loves Daniel, but who does not love Daniel? His son, Belshazzar. So, it's like any administration, when the new administration comes in, I got to clean house because I don't know this guy. I don't trust this guy. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not, but I didn't hire them. Because when you hire someone, you have a bond with them. Belshazzar doesn't know what's going on there, so that's important. The fiery furnace. Do you remember why they're thrown into the fiery furnace?
They wouldn't bow down to the idol.
They prayed anytime, everywhere they wanted to pray.
So now this is part of their 3-year training, right? Okay, here's how you keep the books, and here are the rules, and we're learning all to speak Babylonian or whatever, and then, oh, by the way, to show your obeisance to the king, you have to bow down to his God. Boom. And they're saying, okay, we're good workers, but we're not going to do that.
Their food and drink too, but they eat like vegetarian and stuff, yeah.
Right,
they drink
and they
wine.
were healthier for it,
Yeah.
yeah.
But less happy.
No, they were
Yes.
happy,
No, no.
but they liked it. It's good.
I'm just kidding. So now the Jews who are reading this are going, go, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Here they are in a foreign land and they're staying loyal to God. Oh, but they're going to get in trouble. We know they're going to get in trouble. And they know they were going to get in trouble, but they stand up for their faith in a culture that's violent to their faith. No accommodation.
So where are we now? Where are they now?
They're in Babylon.
Babylon, okay,
They're in Babylon, but at the end of
okay.
so we've already, Nebuchadnezzar's died. Basically, after he interprets the dream, Nebuchadnezzar, who likes Daniel, dies. And now his son takes over and goes, who's Daniel? I don't know. I'm not interested. I got my own team here. So then we're going to have that famous, so he's sending Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace because you didn't bow down. All this is happening under both kings, actually. Handwriting on the wall, Belshazzar takes over the son. I'm just trying to give you a storyline.
Yeah.
Belshazzar takes over, doesn't know Daniel. He's having a feast one night, and all of a sudden, magically, sometimes you'll see this in movies sometimes, all of a sudden there's this handwriting, these 4 things. What is that? If you look in verse, in chapter 4,
Many separate parts. Sounds wonderful.
so, it's I'm trying to think of here, there's that classic, you have been weighed and you've come up short, it's also a phrase we use. So I'll take a look at that. That's the second draft. Look at the first reading. So then we got handwriting on the wall, den of lions. What finally happens is then Belshazzar, there's one of the women, one of his, I think it's his concubine or someone, or wife, says, well, I remember Daniel used to do this type of thing, and he was good at it for your father. Maybe you need to call him in, right? A little bit like Joseph. Sounds a little bit like almost the same storyline, because
Somebody
Joseph got
tells
lost
him.
too,
Mhm.
and then is refound. Well, so is Daniel. He comes in, he can interpret it. And Belshazzar says that whoever interprets this dream, I mean, purple robes, great outfit, we're gonna send you shopping, at the Mercado, and you can have a good time. And what does Daniel say?
Keep 'em. Keep it. Don't want it.
Not interested. He gave it to him anyway.
Yeah.
He gave it to him. You can't say no to the king.
No.
Didn't they
But
assassinate him? Balthasar?
right after the prophecy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Daniel says, this is what it means. Remember, your dad had some little craziness. That was because he was disobedient to God. He set up all these gods against the true God.
He repented.
He goes a little bit crazy, but God calls him to repent, and your father repented, and he got better. You need to do the same thing. Belshazzar doesn't,
Does not.
dies that night,
Mm.
is killed. And that's where then you feel the powers now shifting from Babylon to Persia. And that's where
So
it came.
Daniel is Belshazzar.
He's the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So he's the next on the throne after Nebuchadnezzar.
Daniel and the son have very similar names. There's a
names
Yeah,
T
it
in
says
it.
then
That's the only
Daniel
difference.
also called Belshazzar.
Yeah, great. You don't want that.
It was
Don't let
also a
that-
Babylonian
okay.
god, if I'm not mistaken, too, right? Belteshazzar or
Yeah.
something.
It's you can't have a Jewish name and work in the royal palace, so they
Like
can't call
Hadassah.
him
But
Daniel.
he and that king's son's names real close.
We're real close.
Real
Never-
close.
Never.
I don't know how you pronounce them
neither.
different.
Like one has a T in it, an extra T, otherwise it's
Because
spelled
when I
the
started
same.
reading that, I was like, wait a
Belshazzar and
minute, they're talking
Belshazzar,
about
yeah.
that, and then I had to go back
Yep.
and
Yeah, the
figure
son-
out that that
son
was
of
the
Daniel.
son.
So it's
Confusing.
easy to it's easy to confuse us. So we should have had an editor really change their names.
Call him Tom.
Tom and
Tom, yeah.
Tom and Jerry.
Tom and Jerry, they would have kept it straight. So, and then after this, we've got all these prophetic visions again. It's almost like Ezekiel again, where you're getting these fantastical visions. And you'll see how the video, which I want you to start, get ready to roll on, Daniel. You'll notice one of the key decisions you have to make in interpreting Daniel is he referring just to one historical moment or multiple moments.
Mhm.
So is this a word that only is in reference to this shift of power from Babylon to Persia at that time of Daniel? Or is this a word of comfort to all Jews and later as Christians as we are constantly confronted with evil regimes of oppressive governments of imperial power run amok? Okay, and now everyone's got a different opinion there. So, but that's one of the things we have to decide when we're reading the book.
Yeah.
Okay? Any questions before we jump in?
We're jumping.
Jump.
The Book of Daniel. The story is set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken a wave of Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this 2-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12, it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and it puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. And so the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power, and so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these 2 stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a god, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so, like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts, and like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire, and it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament, and there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The 3 stories of faithfulness despite persecution, these are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final 3 visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final two beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is the image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people and his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that in a sense they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus's empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
All right, that was a lot.
There's a lot to all chapters.
That's a lot, yeah.
That's a lot. I think the difference, I don't know how you feel about it, but you know, when we read Ezekiel, whew, that's a lot of literature. Daniel, you can actually read.
But it's confusing,
But it's right. Once you get in the dreams and the images,
All the kingdoms.
you know,
battles.
so to go back to the Sunday forum, when Olga is describing some of the art in her art gallery, we get the symbols because there are symbols. It's not as hard to read, so to speak. It's harder when you go back 1,000 years and say, oh, these are their symbols. Like a horn on a beast is not something we use now to describe power.
Right.
We might have a throne or a crown, right? Or there might be some other money, I guess you could use. There'd be other ways of describing power, and we get the symbols if we saw them. But now we're looking at Daniel's symbols from way back. Ooh. And remember, a little bit like the slaves here in the United States, you can't just say what you want to say. You get in trouble. So you got to have all this kind of clever language to say what you want to say. So your people know what you're saying, but the other people don't. Right? So you got to get clever.
Are you talking about pronouns?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because there's probably some parallels there. It's insider language, right? And we've all used it to some degree, right? But here you get it in those dreams. And if you're not in the inside, I think we all need a little help when reading Daniel to see what those language is. So I mean, what were your responses what stuck out with you?
When you were saying, Pastor, about the horns, like, to me, it is a symbol of power, because I think about the two males with the horns, it's always the stags or whatever.
Yeah.
When they have that encounter to say who's the boss, so to speak. So to me, that is a powerful symbol. And
That's a good image too. The rams when they're
When
butting heads.
and when the Jewish people, when they bring in the Jewish holidays, that's the shofar, they do that horn, but I think too, like, I'm taking it to today with being careful what you say. I'm thinking of the political landscape right today. People are afraid to really say what they think sometimes. They don't want to be, for lack of a better word, castrated in front of everybody, because they're made to feel as if they're less than. And I think it still exists. I mean, right here, right now, that people are afraid, and I'm reading every day, that people are afraid to come to Florida. Like, wow, that's scary to think that that's the image that we're portraying. We don't want to portray that image.
So yes, and yes, yeah. That's good. So this is, and I think we get this at the end of his film to say, oh, some of these dynamics are still the way he interprets it. It's not narrowly to one situation. He's saying this imagery can be, as you were doing, right, can apply to any of these oppressive moments down through history.
Didn't one of the horns talk too? But they yelling blasphemous things.
It's all good on this one. Everything, it's like the wild west with these images, you know. Although there's some consistency both with Nebuchadnezzar and with Belshazzar, they're both setting up idols that have political ramifications, right? So it's not just some god; it's all tied with the king, right? So when you are bowing to that god, you are also acknowledging the king and his divine authority, just like
Caesar.
Jesus, just like Caesar, right?
In Rome.
Other things that you picked up on.
Well, no matter what happened, you know, it showed that God's in control. Well, in God's sovereign.
Big
I
deal.
always went back to that.
And so they're trying to encourage people like Daniel and the Jews who are in exile to say, stay faithful, hang in there, hang in there. Which is, you can imagine how tough that must have been. You know, don't bow down to idols. And you can imagine these guys going, well, how can I not? You know, I'm going to end up in the fiery furnace, and maybe an angel doesn't come and save me. It was great for Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, but you know, or the lion's den. I thought it was interesting both times that you know, the guy says, "Okay, kill these guys," and then God says, and he goes, "Oh, you guys are really special now." Yeah,
They're trying to say that.
I'm glad you finally come around.
But the king didn't want to actually feed Daniel to the lions, but it was already written, and according to their laws, he couldn't undo it. And he says, "I hope your God saves you." And then after that, of course, he praises God.
So where do you think the state of Israel is in this picture today? Today, the state of Israel today, how are they fitting into this picture?
Ooh, boy, that one's loaded. Well, first, he does mention the Seleucids in 163, I think it is BC. So he does mention that because I think the Seleucids were Jewish Greek, the new oppressors. And they did set up a god in the temple itself. Desecrated it. And that's the great abomination often in that Daniel's referring to. So often historically, when you talk about the great abomination of Daniel, Jews will first say that was the Seleucids. And that created this rebellion because the Maccabees and others were not going to put up with their temple and their religion being desecrated again. Then others say, oh no, it was also the Romans, because the Romans finally come in and also did some of these things, like sacrificing pigs in the temple and then finally destroying the temple. Part of this was trying to humiliate the Jews, right? To desecrate the religious signs, the religious symbols, tick them off. And so then they'll say, oh yeah, but then the Romans did it. And of course, they haven't had a temple since there, but you have now the Temple Mount. But they don't own the temple land. Palestinians do. So now this creates some of this, Kitty, some of this dynamic of what does that mean today? Now, some and this is way too simplistic, but some would say we got to take back the Temple Mount. We got to take back the temple so we can build the temple and fulfill Daniel.
Yeah.
Others are going, oh, boy, if you want a World War III,
Here it is.
just take over the Temple Mount and watch the whole Arab world go up and go in. And then it's going to force everybody to weigh in because Jerusalem is one of these international. You know, I was there once and I was buying something in a store and the guy said, well, you know, when you're in Jerusalem, you're at the center of the universe. So they understand the weightiness of Jerusalem and how all these religions see Jerusalem somehow as part of their core. So there is that feeling of some, you know, the really Orthodox Jews
Yes.
feel strongly that the secular Jews are taking over and ruining religiously Israel because they're not following God's commands.
To the letter.
The secular Jews are going, you guys are all crazy.
Old-fashioned.
You don't serve in the military. You don't help with society. We give you money and you go to your schools and read the Torah, and that's all you do for society, and you're against democracy. To which they respond, yeah, we're against democracy because we're under God's law. We're not under democratic law. That's not Jewish. And then, so you can hear, you're probably reading in the paper all the time that at least those two factions, of course, it's more complicated than that, are at war, and the Jewish community here in the United States reflects some of those same tensions. So if you've ever lived in New York, you picked up on this because you have these big Hasidic communities, and it's all about just obedience to the text. And they read Daniel, and they go, that's what those secular Jews are actually doing, is they're ruining our obedience. They're bowing to idols just openly, not just here in the United States, but also back in Jerusalem. And of course, then the democratic forces are saying, you're installing your Torah, and we don't agree. So it's a long answer, but it's still a dynamic that you can read about in our papers about what's happening there pretty frequently, actually.
Yeah, just another thing that stood out to me was that the two scenes where it talked about God wanting to humble Nebuchadnezzar and making him crazy, right? And then there's a turning, right? There's a turning, and then the scenario with his son, right? Who doesn't turn.
Right.
And it just was kind of comforting again to know that God, you know, if you would say God worked outside of Israel, God works today outside of his church. And you know, is God leaning into, you know, Vladimir Putin and saying, come on, man, do the right thing. You know, do the right thing. Yeah, I don't know, but this text would say that. This text would say, well, he might get humbled and see some light. He might not. And that then made me think about, you know, God really, what we're seeing here too, he's always impressing on the leaders. Please do the right thing. Because if you do the right thing, the people don't suffer. Right?
Even though they're not Jewish or following, that's right, right?
Absolutely.
Still,
The
you've got-
nations. It's still God's vision is all the people. And then to Catherine's point, I was thinking all of us to some degree have authority. It could be small, it could just be authority for now over, I don't know, a position you hold. It could be,
or in our families.
I was just gonna go to our family where you have that authority. So, this idea that God is really gnawing at everybody to, humble yourself, do the right thing.
Mhm.
Even in the smallest of circumstances, which we can relate to, which kind of brings Catherine's point again, which is that tension, right? Do I stand and try to be faithful here, right? So there's not
In the small things as
in
well
the
as
small things,
Mhm.
right? In sort of the little things that come across our path daily.
Because if you're
right?
quiet, it's approval.
That's
It's
right.
approval. It's saying it's
Consent.
okay to do
Mhm.
that, and you know in your heart it's wrong to discriminate against somebody. It's not my place to do that, and it's easier when it's one-on-one or a few people. It's harder when it's a big crowd of people and they have those thoughts that are really negative, and it's a cancer. It's a cancer.
And just to build to the positive, right? That if God is a God who desires humility in our lives, bringing back to Vladimir Putin, wouldn't we want to also act like God and pray for him, right? Pray that he might do the right thing, and pray for those people in authority, not knowing all the complexity of the role, right, and everything, but to pray, sort of, that God's will would be done in their life. I ultimately bring it around to a very simple thing where it's the Lord's Prayer again, right? May your kingdom come.
I think too, so boy, I have a lot of thoughts here. One is all the details in Daniel change, right? As he says, the years don't all match up with any historical event. Maybe that's part of the genius of the book, right? That we have more freedom to interpret it more broadly. Even in Daniel's, he says, "Oh, Jeremiah said 70 years, great, because we're just hitting the end of that 70 years." And God gives him a vision and goes, "Oh no, 70 times 70." You're going, "Oh, you can't do that. You already told
Yes,
Jeremiah 70. I'm going to hold you to your word." I mean, you can feel those tensions there. We got lost in the 70s, with some of these books like Left Behind, because we were clear when the army was going to come down from the north in these latter chapters. We all said it was who? The Russians.
The Russians, Turkey.
No, we said Russians.
I know they said Turkey. I think it's Turkey.
So you because that was our worldview.
Yeah.
You look at the 007 movie. Who were the evil guys? In the 70s. After
Communism,
There's communism, there's Russia, they're gonna come down from the north. So you could see that we were trying to interpret Daniel historically. But then, I was in a Bible study group in Latin America, right, at the same time. And so we're reading this text of Daniel and the hordes coming from the north, the oppressive empire, the horned animal. And someone said, "Well, how do we read this today?" I said, "Well, a lot of people in the United States would feel this is Russia." They all laughed. They just thought that was the funniest thing. They said, "Oh, it's you."
Of course.
We're north of them.
It's you. I'm going, wait a minute. Things just got personal here. Yeah, I mean, for them, it was obvious that the United States was the oppressive empire, because they're in Latin America, of course. And so I went, oh, maybe I have to rethink this thing, So we got to be careful that when we're interpreting these texts, pointing finger at somebody else, that finger can, and so it pushes us to say, with our power as a nation, we can't be oppressive. We can't just look at others and say Putin or Xi or, North Korean's leader. It's easy to point the finger at the other empires that could
China.
clearly fit this Daniel description, because you're right, it's all the nations, right? It's all the leaders have to live according to God's law, or go crazy, or not be restored, or
Maybe
be
they are
murdered.
already crazy and
Yeah,
powerless.
that's why they're right.
Maybe that's how they got there in the first place. That
Right.
seems-
That was good, Jim, that you were putting in, because that was a really good point. Yeah, I like that, thank you.
Okay.
Other things to watch up for is the Son of Man language, again.
Mm.
So when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, it's thinking about Daniel.
Yeah.
So this is
Yeah.
part of how he's interpreting himself. If you want to, or you can just listen, this is one reference to Daniel in Matthew 24 that will be coming up in a couple of weeks. 24 verse 15, these are these tough texts about the destruction of the temple foretold. And in 15, Jesus says, so when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, as was spoken by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains.
Was he talking then about something into the future there?
We're not talking about Matthew today. So that's the big,
Yeah.
now, okay, what's he talking about?
Flee to the mountains.
Was it the Romans? So it's almost as if Jesus is giving us some permission here to say, oh yeah, maybe Daniel at one time was referring to Babylonians, maybe another time it's the Seleucids. Now it's Romans. No, it's Rome.
Yeah.
You know, you kind of get that feel,
Yeah.
but and of course we would say he sort of prophetic for Roman destroying the temple in 70, which would have been about 35 years after the 70. Anything? Oh, the other that the Son of Man will be taken up and sit at the right hand of God to rule the world. I mean,
Yeah, we know.
that's the New Testament image of the
Yes.
ascension.
Yes.
You know, see, and we confess that every Sunday. Sitting at the right hand of the Father. We say, "Who is Jesus?" Sitting at the right hand of the Father. So in essence, what we're saying, oh yeah, Daniel, that happened.
Yeah.
What Daniel foretold, that happened. Jesus died. It said, if you go to Jerusalem today, there's a place where they say this is where he was standing. And if you go look at the rock, there's a little footprint in it. You know, he was standing there when he was taken to heaven. He left the footprint. See, look at it. Everybody's trying to read the story. Anything else that you picked up on before we discuss it? Angels and dreams.
Gabriel and Michael.
Hmm?
I like how they put the archangels in
Yes,
there.
they mentioned
Yeah.
the archangel.
And
Yeah.
70
A lot of
times 7,
revelation
how
in
many times should I turn my cheek?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
That's what that hit me, that
Yeah,
part.
yeah, yeah.
Which 70 times 7 is not a real number.
Right.
It's to say, like,
It's-
we'd say,
It's a big number.
I love you to infinity,
Right.
you know, or whatever one says.
But it almost puts you at the time of Antioch in 160 BC.
That's, Jews go there immediately.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
they set up idol worship right in the temple, you know,
Wow.
and that just set everybody off, you know, you can't do that.
I thought also, can you pass it over here, Teresa? Is that Daniel?
Yeah.
It'd be nice if we had it to look at here, but I like what he said here too at the end of the video. The point of Daniel,
Mhm,
the
promise.
point, okay, I'm paying attention. A pattern and a promise, right? So
Mhm.
here we are
Mhm.
back to what we've been learning for months and months now.
Mhm.
Human beings become beasts. So
Yeah.
that was new language,
Yeah,
but
that
yet we've
was
been
wrong.
hearing a
That's
lot about
wrong,
beasts.
yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
Referring back to when the king was made to be. a
Yes.
beast.
Human beings become beasts when they don't acknowledge God's kingdom. It's kind of like Sound of Freedom. God's kids aren't for sale.
Mhm.
And if you want to go down that road, watch out.
Mm.
You know, it's kind of like,
Mhm.
you know, human beings become beasts when they do not acknowledge God's kingdom. God will one day confront the beast, probably in all of us, right? Our own sin, forgiven in grace, right? And it's kind of, it says God will, so there's good Lutheran theology, and rescue his world, which again, the thing that keeps coming to me, it's just like, what a great story, you know, this, but like, we're in this story, and, but in the end, it seems like God does it, right? God, and you can say he does it through his people, through his church, et cetera, but that's comforting, so I go
I think
back
that's the
to
purpose.
a pattern and a promise.
Daniel was trying to comfort us, you know, with God's faithfulness finally. So I think you're right on with that comment, because it's almost as if the people of God are always going to experience this oppression of
This term.
imperial power. I'll call it imperial power here, whether it's the Syrians or Babylonians or Persians or the Greeks or the Romans or the Russians or ours, as people call us also to account, say, how are you using your power? So we can't escape that judgment. Now, how are you gonna deal with it?
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar repents, comes out pretty good in this thing,
He does.
you know,
So,
which is amazing. Really? And I think that gives the Jews some hope in this text too, to say, wow, look, Daniel stood up for what was right, gave witness to God, and look what happened.
All the kings like Daniel. Pretty much.
And somehow the kings recognize when someone stood up for what was right, then it's not just about power or domination. They respond to an ethical, you've got to live according to God's law. They seem to respond here, so.
And every good, it's funny how like somehow deep in our spirit, we're drawn to these realities of the human being becoming a beast, because every Netflix, every good story is laced with here's the person or the life. The life gets either oppressed or the life is corrupt. And then there is a figure who somehow brings about justice, and we all end with like, yeah, you know what I mean?
Unless evil wins at the end of the movie, then we all go home
Then we're
mad.
like, this is not cool. Yeah, but all good stories, and here we are in the great story.
Okay, that's just one more thing that, because I've left this world a little bit, but when I went back and saw my daughter and the two grandkids, and you watch kid shows, it's all about good versus evil.
yes.
I mean, it's all, I mean, we've all learned that, didn't we? Didn't we run into those stories too? It wasn't just Sunday school, right? When
Couple on Cassidy.
good and evil, right?
Legion of Doom.
Alone, right?
Yeah, well, Batman, all the stuff we watched, even down to Popeye, I'm just like,
Popeye.
random comment here, when he got his spinach and then could he could
I'm glad you paid me for a
could
perfect
defeat
follow.
evil. What was his girlfriend? It was olive oil. And olive oil is always good for you.
It is.
She always says that little one.
She gets a sandwich.
And so with Popeye's inspiration, let's get in our small groups. And I think, yeah, we're really off topic now. I mean, but go back to the text. What is it that you pull out for yourself in these texts? We'll take about 10-15 minutes. She was also a psychologist, and so we were talking about original sin in these terms. And she said, she had a different take on it. She said, we're all 97% really good people. But then she said, but that 3% will kill you. That's sort of that's where the horns come out, What other, so what you're saying is it's not just about kingdom and kingdoms and imperial power. We got some of that.
Hosea.
Right, like Jim said, we all have control, we're all,
Hosea.
Hosea is next week.
we all have those thoughts, bad
Are we
thoughts, or
done
what have you.
with Daniel then?
Almost.
The government.
It's kind of interesting too. I've just, I don't know what parallel I'm trying to make here. But I had the conversation, I think 4 times in the last 3 weeks. That's why I'm thinking about that comment, is how we age. And I think we've all seen certain people age really graciously. They actually get softer and
And some don't.
more approachable, and some don't. Some, some of the horns come out.
They don't mellow out.
And in the 4 cases I'm thinking of, but I'm probably also thinking about my family, you can't always know which is what's going, this sweet, wonderful young woman turns into a,
Well, that's what they say, always look at the girl's mother. If you want to know what the girl's going to
does that work out?
A lot of times.
Yeah.
A lot of times,
Yeah,
yeah.
a lot of
Genetics,
times
yeah.
it does.
Why don't they look at the father?
Nobody looks at the.
It's just Ken.
It's just painful over here, right?
It's just Ken.
It's just Ken.
You got a good husband.
I don't know if you heard Matt's comment. He said, it's just Ken.
Going back to Barbie.
Going back to Barbie, all things go back.
Back to
I'll tell you though, I told Jim this, that Sound of Freedom has outstripped Barbie this
Good.
summer.
I'm glad.
And that surprised me a little bit, you know, because we were talking Barbie's kind of light and fun, but had a theological component, but it was still light and humorous and I think also fun to discuss. Sound of Freedom is hard. It's a hard story, right? Not as, I didn't think would be as popular. But for some reason, there's all sorts of speculation we've discussed. That one has outstripped even the goodbye video to Pastor Steve,
Wow,
which has been our highest, you know, for obvious reasons.
yeah.
Because it was so emotional. It was goodbye to Steve. It had his son's, you know, letter, which was just so touching. And but Sound of Freedom is touching something in people that you're kind of talking about, that sort of core, you know, God's children are not for sale. It's that sort of clarity, that moral clarity that I think we're all looking for, right? Instead of getting caught up in just power this, power that, can we win? You know, what do we do to win? And all of a sudden the clarity of Daniel comes out. Boom. Other things that
I'm just gonna keep going with Melissa there, because it's my own little journey. Okay, we say as Lutherans, we are both saint and sinner
Yes.
at the same time, right?
Yes,
So
yes, yes.
you know the story of the prodigal.
Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah, but I wanna try to venture in that a little deeper with the story of the prodigals, the prodigal son, right? There's the prodigal, there's the brother, and there's the father, right? And so I've often looked at that as three distinct people, right? Which they are.
We are all three.
Thank you. Wow. So the point that Melissa just said is that the truth is that we play the role of all three, which is very hopeful and yet really good theology, meaning God is always kind of saying, play the role of the dad, please, you know, play the role of the father,
Be forgiving.
right? The compassionate, the longing for his son, the seeking after the lost sheep. And then also the reality that at any given moment, you can act like the brother.
It's unfair.
I'm jealous. You
But
spend all this time,
I
I
can
gotta
see
share mom.
his side, because he feels his brother went off and had his wife, had his money, and he was back home taking care of business.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Right,
I
but
can-
what- but that's-
Yeah, so
I can like all three.
That's not my point. My point is, we can be that person, however he is, but we can be that person, and even sadly, even more sadly, that we can be the prodigal. Even if you're, to your point, even when you're 70, 80 years old, you can downright act like a prodigal.
Sure.
And that is capable. So I guess that's kind of my sort of building on saint and sinner. And also I think too, as we get older, the role of the elder too is that God would want us all to know all three of those, because you really can't get away from it. But primarily rest in being the father, right? So rest in being the father.
Redemption.
Which is an incredibly suffering role. See, it's not really a glorious, it's kind of you've arrived, but now you really gotta suffer. Right?
That's why they say it's a golden age, forget it.
It's rusty.
It's not the sissies.
Because you hold your whole life, the good, the bad, and everything around it. You can't unhook yourself from that. So there is a degree of weight that goes into becoming older, becoming the father.
So I'm promoting the Sunday Forum again. The last piece that Olga shows from her gallery is a forest scene in the autumn. As she says, the golden years of, she said, I like this painting because it connects with people who live in Naples. So, oh, here we go. And the trees, she interpreted, there were three trees as the Trinity, but also as family, as community, by a river. But of course, because it's autumn, what's lying all around dying? So you know, she interprets it, but it's our golden years, we're dying, we're aging. And yet, look how gorgeous.
Beautiful. That's
But
And
why
then-
the water, the source of life?
And all the little seedlings are all around those trees.
the upcoming.
And she goes, those are our kids and grandkids, and they haven't been tested yet. Are they gonna make it through the winter, you know? We don't know yet. Can they become as solid as, you know, us, the trees are? So she goes into all this, you know, which is, again, prompted Melissa to respond. But it was a wonderful description of those things, that
Yeah.
where are we in the painting? Not only where is God in the painting, and you're saying like in the prodigal, the story is told that we're in all those roles.
Right.
At some,
Makes a good sermon.
I'll think about it for,
Yeah.
Or tabletop.
yeah. Anything else? One thing you might want to hold on to, I found this and I just loved it. I'll just show this briefly if you're interested, because that's so helpful. But here is a picture of idol with the four interpretations
Yes.
of the different imperial powers that it represented. I just think seeing it, I don't know if your Bibles have it. This is a really interesting serendipity Bible, and they have some really wonderful things in it. But want to hold on to that one because I think that's a very powerful image coming out.
Different paintings, yeah.
Let's end with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, so many dreams, so many clarion calls for faithfulness. We hear Daniel and his friends and how they stood up for the faith in difficult times. We hear about kings who both repented and didn't repent. But we hear the word that you will be faithful to us in the big picture of life. And we pray that we can hold on to that. And that would give us hope as we look to you in our situation today. Bless us now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Watch the Sunday Forum. Send me if you've got a picture that talks to you at home. Send it. I'd really love to see this.